Reggie Monroe had spent over 2 decades serving as a dedicated officer of the law, navigating the rigors of city streets and delicate community relations. Upon retiring, he yearned for a quiet life unburdened by the high-pressure responsibilities that once consumed him. When he discovered a modest home nestled in Lakeside Grove, he believed it to be the perfect place to begin his post-police chapter, a setting defined by tree-lined streets, calm neighbors, and minimal drama. From the moment Reggie stepped onto his new porch, he felt optimistic about settling into this slower pace. Despite a couple of minor yard repairs and a bit of paint needed on the eaves, the house charmed him. The neighbors he met during his initial tour seemed friendly enough, offering polite nods and the occasional wave of welcome. He promised himself that in Lakeside Grove, he would finally relish the unhurried peace that had eluded him for years. But calm can be deceptive. Within weeks, Reggie noticed odd fluctuations in his home internet speeds, sometimes cripplingly slow, other times surging back to normal. At first, he attributed it to an overtaxed router or a glitch from his service provider. Only after some troubleshooting did Reggie discover evidence suggesting someone nearby was piggybacking on his Wi-Fi. He found the idea unsettling yet somewhat trivial. Neighbors occasionally borrow signals if networks aren't secured. As a former officer, though, he disliked the notion of uninvited use of his private connection, especially given potential security risks. A bit more sleuthing led Reggie to suspect that Teresa Watkins, the elderly widow living 2 doors down, might be involved. Rumors abounded in Lakeside Grove that Teresa prided herself on cutting corners to save $1, refusing to pay for cable or reliable internet if she could siphon resources from someone else. But Reggie had never interacted with her long enough to confirm those stories, until one afternoon when a chance conversation with another neighbor confirmed that Teresa frequently boasted about free internet. He decided to solve the matter without commotion. He'd update his router's password, tightening security protocols so only his devices could access it. If Teresa truly was the culprit, the slow speeds and unauthorized logins would vanish, and the issue would quietly fade away. He found no need for confrontation, hoping that a blocked connection would gently encourage her to sign up for her own service. Little did Reggie know that this small act, an ordinary home networking update, would spark a confrontation with far-reaching consequences. He had always anticipated a drama-free retirement, trusting in the neighborly goodwill that typically thrives in a suburban setting like Lakeside Grove. Yet, behind Teresa Watkins's polite smiles lurked a sense of entitlement and prejudice, soon to be unleashed the moment she realized her free Wi-Fi privileges had evaporated. The stage was set for a clash that challenged Reggie's quest for tranquility, testing his patience and reaffirming the instincts he'd honed over his years of service. When Reggie Monroe updated his router's password, he assumed the problem would vanish quietly. But as evening settled over Lakeside Grove, an unexpected knock at his door signaled otherwise. Opening it, he found Teresa Watkins standing stiffly on the porch, arms folded. The lines on her face radiated both indignation and a sense of wounded pride. Without greeting him, Teresa launched into a tirade. "I've been disconnected all day," she proclaimed, as though her predicament was Reggie's responsibility. "You've changed the password, haven't you?" The question came off more as an accusation than a polite inquiry. Reggie's initial shock at her bluntness gave way to a mixture of curiosity and amusement. After all, she just admitted to piggybacking on his network without permission. "Ms. Watkins, my internet connection is private," he said calmly. "I decided to secure it further. If you need internet access, the local provider offers affordable plans." His measured tone belied the exasperation brewing beneath the surface. Teresa responded by snorting with derision, implying that paying for her own internet was an unnecessary expense she shouldn't have to bear. The conversation quickly turned heated. Teresa insisted that Reggie was denying a neighbor a basic service and asserted that, as a retiree on a fixed income, she deserved some break. Her sense of entitlement stirred memories in Reggie. He'd encountered a spectrum of personalities during his years in law enforcement, some pushing the boundaries of what they felt owed to them. Yet never had he imagined facing such a brazen demand in a quiet residential area. Reggie tried to keep the exchange civil, reminding Teresa that unauthorized Wi-Fi use was both unethical and a potential security risk. She scoffed, dismissing the notion that just using the internet could carry any real implications. Her argument tiptoed around a deeper, more unsettling tone, one that Reggie recognized from subtle cues in her language. Comments about people like you picking on retirees hinted at prejudice extending beyond just the matter of free internet. As the tension mounted, a couple of neighbors passing by slowed their steps, evidently drawn by Teresa's raised voice. Undeterred by the small audience, Teresa continued her complaints, refusing any suggestion that she might be in the wrong. She turned the conversation personal, questioning Reggie's background and whether his professional training went to his head. But if she expected him to lose composure, she was mistaken. Reggie's calm in the face of confrontation was an asset honed over years of managing volatile situations. Finally, Teresa ended with a vow, "You'll regret shutting me off. I have my ways." With that, she pivoted sharply and stalked back down the walkway. Closing his door, Reggie exhaled, wondering how a routine Wi-Fi adjustment had ignited such animosity. Unknown to him, the tension rippling through Lakeside Grove was set to surge, fueled by Teresa's sense of injustice and her readiness to escalate a petty grievance into something more serious. For Wyatt Carter, a newly retired black police officer, life in Cedarwood Acres was supposed to be refreshingly simple. Gone were the days of tense street patrols and high-pressure investigations. In his first few weeks at the new house, Wyatt enjoyed strolling through the tree-lined roads, greeting neighbors, and catching glimpses of the tranquil suburban routine he'd hoped for. Yet that hopeful calm began to fray when he sensed peculiar slowdowns in his home internet, leading him to suspect an unauthorized user. Unbeknownst to Wyatt, a neighbor named Marjorie Billings, rumored to be a penny-pinching widow with a penchant for meddling, had quietly tapped into his Wi-Fi network. She found the arrangement convenient and cost-free, apparently believing that a bit of unapproved internet borrowing caused no harm. Wyatt only discovered her trick when his speeds dipped dramatically, prompting him to scrutinize his router logs. The readouts revealed a persistent, unidentified device that had been siphoning bandwidth for weeks. Wyatt decided to solve the issue with minimal fuss. Changing the password to a more secure, cryptic string, he figured the problem would end. He had no desire to confront Marjorie directly, hoping she'd accept the newfound inability to connect as a gentle nudge to procure her own service. However, the next day brought an unexpected knock at his door, and there stood Marjorie, her posture betraying irritation, if not outright anger. "How dare you lock me out of the Wi-Fi," she declared, as though Wyatt's home network were community property. Her voice carried that haughty undertone reminiscent of someone certain they held moral high ground. Wyatt, caught off guard by her boldness, tried to explain that it was his private connection, and that unauthorized use posed security risks. But Marjorie refused to budge, insinuating that Wyatt was overreacting, and that people, in her situation, needed breaks wherever they could find them. When Wyatt gently pointed out the matter of principle, stealing is stealing, whether it's intangible bandwidth or physical goods, Marjorie scoffed. She made passing references to him being too controlling and implied that a retired officer should be more lenient, especially toward seniors. Yet the mild prejudice hidden in her remarks didn't escape Wyatt's notice, reinforced by subtle jabs about types of people who ruin neighborhoods. Her insinuations felt both personal and bigoted, tainting an otherwise simple dispute. The conversation ended on a tense note, with Marjorie threatening that she would not let the matter rest, hinting at bigger repercussions for Wyatt's refusal to share. Watching her stomp away, Wyatt realized the conflict was far from resolved. The entire incident signaled that he wasn't dealing with just an ordinary neighborly misunderstanding. Marjorie's entitlement and bias hinted at potential escalation. Still, he resolved to respond calmly, trusting that reason and the truth would ultimately prevail. Little did he know, her next steps would push the situation far beyond a mere scuffle over internet access. The day Lionel Daniels decided to tighten his home internet security was the day tensions exploded on Meadowpoint Lane. He'd spent a quiet morning verifying that no unauthorized devices lurked on his Wi-Fi. It seemed every attempt he made to reduce intrusion only further roused suspicion from Geraldine Radcliffe, the widow next door known for her insatiable curiosity. When Lionel locked down the final settings on his router, he thought that would be the end of it, an invisible fix that might quietly persuade Geraldine to invest in her own service. But she had other ideas. As soon as Lionel left his porch to grab the mail, he spotted Geraldine approaching from her side of the fence. Her gait was tense, a storm brewing in her gray-blue eyes. She wasted no time in letting him know she'd discovered the new password barrier. "My devices can't connect," she barked, as though her right to free internet was enshrined in local law. Lionel drew a measured breath, calmly preparing to explain that her prior access was never authorized. In the short exchange that followed, Geraldine's tone took on an increasingly hostile edge, laced with barbs about Lionel's background and what she perceived as his officious approach. She insisted she had talked to some people, and that restricting her from basic amenities was cruelty, especially given her widow status. Lionel tried to interject, reminding her that the local provider had budget plans or senior discounts, but his suggestions were dismissed with a scoff. She implied that a man with his history, a not-so-subtle jab at his law enforcement career and, perhaps, his race, should show more leniency. The conversation escalated further when Geraldine threatened to call law enforcement herself, painting Lionel as the real trespasser on Meadowpoint Lane. The irony wasn't lost on him. He'd served in uniform for decades, yet here she was insinuating he was the problem. He calmly produced a small card verifying his retired officer status, hoping to quell any notion that he was up to no good. The action backfired. Geraldine misread it as him trying to intimidate her or, worse, impersonate an active official to gain some moral advantage. "Don't flash me fake badges," she snapped, brandishing her phone. "You can't fool me with phony credentials. I'll have 911 sort this out." Her voice rose, echoing down the sleepy street. A few neighbors peered out windows or paused in their yard work, drawn by the commotion. Lionel, heart sinking, recognized that Geraldine's anger was about to morph into a spectacle he neither wanted nor deserved. He tried to reason with her, but she was too incensed to listen, punching numbers into her phone with trembling fingers. Lionel observed her conversation with the dispatcher from a careful distance, picking up phrases like, "man outside my house," "acting suspicious," and "threatening me with a badge." The spin she placed on his simple act of identification was dizzying. Soon enough, distant sirens signaled that local patrol was on its way. Lionel silently thanked fate that he'd left a robust paper trail of her harassing behavior, plus logs showing unauthorized Wi-Fi logins. He knew how quickly allegations could spiral if officers arrived to find a distressed older woman and him, a retired policeman, at odds. Several minutes later, a patrol car rolled onto the lane, its lights flickering across the manicured lawns. Officer Calder stepped out, surveying the scene with a practiced calm. Geraldine rushed forward, brandishing her phone in one hand and gesturing frantically with the other. She repeated her claims that Lionel had threatened her, refusing to let her access essential services, her twisted interpretation of free Wi-Fi, apparently. But Officer Calder recognized Lionel almost immediately. He'd once been a rookie in a precinct near where Lionel served. A flicker of recognition passed across the officer's face, prompting him to hear Lionel out. Lionel recounted how he'd found multiple unknown logins to his network, how he'd changed the password, and how Geraldine had been siphoning bandwidth without permission. Calder asked if Lionel had proof, and Lionel nodded, retrieving on his phone a quick screenshot of the suspicious log and matching it to a device ID that repeated use at times of slow speeds. The story felt so mundane yet so bizarre, someone so incensed at losing free internet that they'd call the police. Geraldine tried to interject, weaving a narrative that she'd done nothing except politely ask for help. She insisted Lionel had overreacted. But as Calder probed deeper, asking how exactly Lionel's changing of his personal password constituted a threat, it became clear that Geraldine's complaint lacked substance. The officer inquired whether she had proof of him impersonating an officer. When pressed, she only referenced the card Lionel displayed, a legitimate ID showing retired status. Her arguments increasingly resembled hearsay or misguided assumptions. Calder politely requested that Geraldine keep her voice down, scanning the small crowd of curious neighbors who'd gathered. By now, an odd hush had fallen, everyone awaiting the conclusion. "Ms. Radcliffe," the officer said, "it appears you called 911 over a private matter involving Wi-Fi usage. You also alleged impersonation, but we see an authentic ID. That's not a valid reason for an emergency call." Geraldine stammered, trying to shift blame onto Lionel for being too secretive. Lionel exhaled a silent relief. The situation might still be precarious if Geraldine decided to file official complaints, but at least the immediate sense of peril had eased. Officer Calder's stance indicated mild disapproval toward Geraldine's dramatics. When she realized the tide had turned, she huffed and retreated to her porch, leaving the officer to finalize his discussion with Lionel. The confrontation ended with Calder noting that no criminal wrongdoing by Lionel was found, and that any further disputes over internet usage should be addressed civilly. Thus concluded the tense standoff, though Lionel suspected Geraldine might harbor deeper resentments. As Calder departed, Lionel thanked him for being thorough. For the rest of that day, Lionel tried to salvage some sense of normalcy, though he couldn't help but feel unsettled by how swiftly a single, trivial action, securing his network, had erupted into a public scene. If anything, the incident reinforced his conviction that prejudice and entitlement, when unchecked, could overshadow even the simplest aspects of daily life in Meadowpoint Lane. The situation on Portside Lane took a sudden turn one late afternoon when Terence McMillan, a retired black police officer, realized his modest act of changing his home internet password had ignited an unexpected conflict. That single step, aimed at securing his Wi-Fi from unknown devices, quickly brought Francesca Holloway to his doorstep. Her annoyance had been palpable in the days since she'd been cut off from the free connection she'd been covertly using. But Terence hadn't anticipated just how bold or accusatory she would become. Standing on his porch, arms crossed, Francesca demanded an explanation. "Why would you shut me out?" she snapped, as though Terence's router were public property. He calmly insisted on the obvious, that it was his personal network, never intended for open community access, and that any unauthorized usage risked not only slow speeds but also potential security breaches. That message, however, didn't sit well with Francesca. She retorted that he was making a big fuss over something that cost him no real loss, as though paying for her own internet plan were an unreasonable burden. Her tone grew increasingly combative. Subtle jabs about Terence's background, he was, after all, a retired officer who recently moved to Portside Lane, surfaced, hinting she felt threatened or outraged by his presence. The conversation was on the edge of devolving into a shouting match when Terence decided to deploy a calmer strategy. He retrieved his old police credentials from his wallet, hoping to show that he understood security deeply and took it seriously. In his mind, this might clarify that he wasn't just being paranoid, he had first-hand knowledge of how even small digital intrusions could lead to bigger crimes. But the gesture backfired spectacularly. As soon as Francesca glimpsed the badge, her expression shifted from anger to suspicion, and she glared at Terence with what could only be described as practiced defiance. "You think you can flash a fake badge at me?" she spat. "Is that how you intimidate people into letting you do whatever you want?" Terence, stunned, attempted to clarify that he was indeed a legitimate, retired officer, and that the ID in his hand was entirely genuine. Yet, it became evident that Francesca wasn't looking for a conversation, she was seizing upon a fresh angle to bolster her sense of victimhood. Her voice pitched higher as she hammered him with accusations. "You're impersonating a cop. You're a fraud." The notion that a retired policeman possessing authentic credentials could be called a fraud struck Terence as absurd, but Francesca latched onto the claim with unsettling fervor. The glint in her eyes suggested she relished the idea of reversing roles, painting him as the suspicious character who needed to prove himself. Other neighbors along the street, who had initially turned a blind eye to Francesca's manipulations, began to notice the brewing confrontation. Some hovered near open windows, while a couple took cautious steps onto their porches, uncertain whether to intervene. Terence felt the weight of their stares, worried that this fiasco might overshadow the real issue, that Francesca had been stealing his internet service. Instead, she had skillfully directed the spotlight on him as a purported imposter. An internal alarm bell rang in Terence's mind. He knew how quickly false narratives could spiral once the rumor mill started churning. The last thing he needed was an official complaint about impersonation lodging him in a messy legal dispute. And sure enough, Francesca, phone in hand, began tapping numbers with an air of vengeful triumph. She turned away just enough so Terence couldn't fully see the screen but recognized she was dialing 911. "Hello, 911. There's a suspicious man on my porch, claiming to be an officer. He's showing me some kind of fake badge." Francesca's voice took on a theatrical tremor. "I'm worried for my safety. This is an emergency." The last line was especially galling. It was Terence's quiet suburban porch, in broad daylight, over something as mundane as a Wi-Fi password. Yet, Francesca's narrative cast him as a threatening figure, conjuring the possibility that responding officers might approach with preconceived notions. Terence wrestled with the instinct to argue more forcefully. But his professional experience cautioned that any abrupt or defensive moves could be spun as aggression. He mustered composure, reminding himself that the truth, along with documented evidence of unauthorized Wi-Fi usage, would stand on his side. If the police arrived, he hoped their objectivity would prevail, and that neighbors might confirm the real story if it came to that. Throughout Francesca's phone call, her voice soared, broadcasting her allegations. She claimed Terence threatened her with a fake badge, repeating that he's no real officer. The unsubtle subtext implied that only certain individuals belonged in Portside Lane, fueling a sense of prejudice that Terence had confronted all too often in his past career. Despite the surge of frustration welling up inside, he responded with calm, restating his identity if only so any bystanders might overhear the truth. By the time she concluded her call, Terence heard a siren in the distance, an ominous cue that law enforcement was en route. A hollow pit formed in his stomach, knowing how complicated the arrival could become if the responding unit took her hysterical account at face value. Francesca, for her part, gloated in the flush of her successful ploy, certain she'd cornered Terence with a brand new set of accusations. In that charged moment, he recognized that bridging reason with prejudice was rarely straightforward. He could only stand firm, phone in pocket, awaiting the next stage of a confrontation that had escalated from stolen bandwidth to accusations of impersonating law enforcement. When Officer Brian Miller finally arrived at David Johnson's home on Dairywood Lane, the early evening sky was painted in soft hues of pink and orange. The community pool drama had evolved into a full-blown neighborhood spectacle by the time Brian and his partner, Officer Nguyen, pulled up in their squad car. As they stepped out, Brian recognized David immediately, not only from departmental records, but from the countless commendations David had earned as a respected black police officer. David greeted them calmly at the edge of his driveway, holding his phone as evidence. "Thank you for coming so quickly," he said, voice measured. "I think you'll want to see this footage first." He handed Brian the device, and together they watched a clip showing Mildred Abernathy wielding a hammer, striking David's solar panels. The camera then captured David's composed demeanor as he recorded her, followed by her escalating tirade of racist insults and baseless accusations. Brian exchanged a glance with Nguyen. "You've got quite a case here," he murmured, rewinding to catch Mildred's loud proclamation, "I'm calling the police, I'm scared for my life." The absurdity of her claim, given she was on David's own property, did not escape them. David pointed out the timestamp, around 3 a.m., and the officers noted how unusual it was for someone to weaponize emergency services over garden decorations and solar panels. As they finished reviewing the footage, Mildred reappeared on her porch across the street, her expression a mix of defiance and faux innocence. She saw the officers approaching David and hurried over, phone still in hand, ready to amplify her version of events. "Officer, I'm the victim here," she insisted, her voice quavering with feigned fear. "This man threatened me, and he's damaging my property." She gestured wildly toward David's yard. Brian listened politely, then calmly addressed David. "Mr. Johnson, we'll need to take statements from both sides. Miss Abernathy, could you step back and let us speak with Mr. Johnson first?" Mildred bristled but complied, muttering under her breath about injustice and harassment. Brian and Gwyn then spoke with David in the driveway. He walked them through the timeline, how he'd arrived home, discovered the vandalism, and captured the incident on his phone. He showed them his police credentials, not to intimidate but to clarify his background and seriousness about security. Brian nodded appreciatively at the credentials. "Thank you for showing those," he said. "We can verify your status, but right now let's focus on the facts here." Next, they approached Mildred, who was still clutching her phone. Brian asked her to recount her 911 call, prompting her to explain how David supposedly confronted her for no reason and threatened her. As she spoke, Nguyen quietly scrolled through her call logs on her own device, confirming the time of her call and the absence of any prior complaints. Brian then asked if she had any proof of the alleged threats. No video, no witnesses, nothing but her own frantic voice on the recording. Mildred's defenses began to crumble under the officer's calm questioning. When asked if she'd ever used David's solar panels before to see if they were operational, she hesitated. She hadn't. When asked if she had any receipts for repair work David supposedly ordered, she said no. It became clear that her claims of victimhood were unfounded. Brian then produced a citation for felony vandalism and false reporting. "Miss Abernathy, you have the right to remain silent," he recited the Miranda warning. "Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law. You are under arrest for vandalism of private property and filing a false police report." He placed her in handcuffs gently but firmly, ensuring she understood the gravity of her actions. Neighbors who had gathered behind police tape watched in stunned silence. Some shook their heads in disbelief, others quietly applauded Brian's professional handling of the situation. Mildred, now in the back of the squad car, continued to protest, insisting she was the wronged party. Brian and Nguyen shared a look of weary resignation, aware that this was far from the typical neighborhood disturbance they'd expected. As they prepared to transport Mildred to the station, Brian turned to David. "Thank you for your patience, sir," he said. "We'll file the report and ensure the evidence is logged properly. You're free to go about your evening now." David offered a brief nod of gratitude, relief and fatigue mingling in his expression. With Mildred in custody, the immediate crisis was over. Yet for David, the night had underscored a painful truth: even in peaceful communities, prejudice and entitlement could spark serious conflict. As the patrol car's lights receded down Dairywood Lane, David turned back to his battered solar panels, already plotting how best to restore them. The ordeal would leave its mark, but at least justice had prevailed, thanks to the professionalism and empathy of officers like Brian Miller. In the days following Mildred Abernathy's arrest, Detective Marcus Reynolds focused on fortifying the case against her. Though the initial footage and police citations were strong, Marcus knew that successful prosecution required a comprehensive portrait of her behavior. He began by collecting witness statements from neighbors who had endured Mildred's petty complaints over the years. Everything from garden gnome placement to the volume of lawnmowers. Each minor irritation she had inflicted now formed a mosaic of harassment. One by one, Marcus visited residents of Dairywood Lane, armed with a notepad and a quiet determination. An elderly couple spoke of how Mildred once insisted they repaint their fence a dozen times. A young family recalled how she reported them to the HOA for leaving a single bike in the driveway. Another neighbor mentioned how Mildred had scolded him for washing his car on a Sunday afternoon. Each anecdote, minor in isolation, took on new significance when assembled into a pattern of vindictive control. As Marcus documented these accounts, he cross-referenced them with official HOA records. Indeed, Mildred's name appeared on more complaint forms than anyone else in the neighborhood. She had even drafted bylaw amendments, none of which passed, but they revealed her relentless drive to enforce her personal preferences. Marcus realized that these HOA filings, combined with her criminal acts of vandalism and false reporting, painted a comprehensive picture of her abuse of authority. Meanwhile, local reporters who had initially sensationalized the 911 call and vandalism story began digging deeper. They discovered Mildred's HOA amendments and her history of confrontations. The headlines shifted from "Retired Detective Solar Panels Vandalized" to "HOA President Arrested for Harassment." Public opinion followed suit. What had once seemed like a bizarre property dispute now appeared as a cautionary tale of unchecked entitlement. Marcus also liaised with the HOA board, ensuring they understood the gravity of Mildred's actions. Some board members, previously reluctant to confront her because of her long-standing service, now expressed regret for allowing her to wield power unchallenged. They issued a formal apology to Marcus, acknowledging that their internal processes had failed to protect residents from frivolous and malicious complaints. The board's newfound cooperation proved invaluable. They granted Marcus access to HOA archives, further solidifying the timeline of Mildred's incessant meddling. At the same time, Marcus reached out to local civil rights organizations, given the racist undertones in some of Mildred's remarks toward him. Though the primary charges were vandalism and false reporting, the evidence of prejudice strengthened the case and underscored the broader social implications. Community leaders praised Marcus for not only standing up for his own rights but for highlighting how bias could manifest in the guise of upholding neighborhood standards. By the time the preliminary hearing date approached, the state's attorney's office had assembled a robust packet. Police reports, witness statements, HOA records, security camera footage, and audio clips of Mildred's slurs. With this arsenal, the prosecutor felt confident in pursuing charges that included felony vandalism, filing a false police report, and possibly even hate crime enhancements. On the day of the hearing, the courtroom buzzed with more than the usual local interest. Several residents, some of whom had provided statements, sat in the gallery, a silent testament to the community's desire for accountability. Marcus, clad in a suit rather than his uniform, sat at the prosecutor's table, reviewing notes. Mildred, looking gaunt and defiant, took the stand to offer her version of events. Her testimony, however, faltered under cross-examination. She contradicted herself on key details, admitted she had no proof of Marcus's alleged wrongdoing, and reluctantly acknowledged she'd used his internet without permission. As the hearing concluded, the judge set bail and a trial date, remarking that the evidence suggested a clear pattern of malicious harassment. The community breathed a collective sigh of relief. Many residents who had previously tolerated Mildred's petty edicts now felt vindicated. The neighborhood, they hoped, could finally move past the discord she had sown. For Marcus, the culmination of his investigative efforts offered a bittersweet victory. While he was relieved that justice had progressed, he was mindful that the ordeal had exposed deep fissures within Dairywood Lane, a community he still considered home. As he left the courthouse, he greeted familiar faces in the crowd, hearing words of gratitude and support. The road ahead would involve further legal steps, but at least the momentum was on the side of truth and fairness, rather than entitlement and prejudice. Shortly after the preliminary hearing, Mildred Abernathy faced the full weight of her actions. The judge issued a formal citation for theft of services, an offense tied to her unauthorized use of Marcus's Wi-Fi, and another for filing a false police report, given her 911 call accusing Marcus of threats that never occurred. The documentation from the HOA, along with neighbor testimonies, ensured that Mildred's litany of petty complaints could no longer be dismissed as mere eccentricity. As the citations were served, word spread rapidly through Dairywood Lane. A small crowd gathered outside the municipal building, including several residents who had quietly supported Marcus. They exchanged nods of approval, many acknowledging how Mildred's relentless harassment had poisoned what should have been a harmonious community. In stark contrast, Marcus, who'd once tried to handle the matter discreetly, found himself openly praised. Neighbors approached him with handshakes and words of gratitude, commending his restraint and the thorough way he documented each incident. Though Marcus accepted their thanks with humility, he felt a deep sense of relief. The vindication was not about personal pride, it was about restoring order and ensuring that no resident could weaponize petty grievances into legal or social warfare. The formal citation marked a turning point, Mildred's pattern of behavior had crossed legal boundaries, and the community could move forward without the shadow of her intimidation. Meanwhile, Mildred retreated to her home in subdued silence. The realization that her complaints had led to actual legal consequences seemed to dawn on her. She had once paraded her HOA status as a shield against accountability, but now she faced tangible repercussions, an unanticipated outcome of her escalating vendetta. Marcus, reflecting on the chain of events, recognized how precarious neighborhood relations could be. A simple password change, a routine security measure, had ignited a conflict fueled by prejudice and entitlement. He had considered moving away, frustrated by the ordeal, but the outpouring of support convinced him otherwise. Dairywood Lane remained his home, and he resolved to continue fostering goodwill, not only as a retired officer but as a neighbor committed to unity. By week's end, the HOA board held a meeting to discuss revisions to their complaint process. They proposed new guidelines requiring stronger evidence for serious allegations and measures to prevent misuse of emergency services for trivial disputes. Marcus attended, offering his perspective on balancing community standards with individual rights. The board adopted several of his suggestions, signaling a new chapter for the neighborhood. As the sun set on Dairywood Lane, Marcus returned to his porch, gazing at the tranquil street. He took out his phone and glanced at the video footage he'd recorded, clear evidence that, when used responsibly, could protect the innocent and uphold justice. The modest cottage felt like home once more, free from the specter of arbitrary accusations. In the quiet that followed, Marcus smiled softly, appreciating the normalcy he had fought to reclaim. The citations against Mildred were not merely punitive, they were a reminder that respect and reason must guide community life. And as he closed his laptop, ready for a restful evening, he felt confident that, in Dairywood Lane, fairness had triumphed over fear. Within days of Mildred Abernathy receiving her citations, word circulated that she planned to leave Dairywood Lane for good. The once prominent HOA president, who had wielded her authority with an iron fist, now found herself the subject of whispered gossip. Some speculated she'd move in with relatives, others suggested she'd retire to a distant town where her reputation wouldn't precede her. Regardless of the reason, her departure felt like a collective exhale for the community. On the afternoon she loaded her last box into a rental van, a handful of neighbors paused on their lawns, offering curt nods rather than the warm waves they once gave her. They had witnessed her meteoric fall, from HOA overlord to a cited harasser. As the van rolled away, its engine hum seemed to underscore the end of her reign of pettiness. Meanwhile, Marcus Johnson, formerly Detective Marcus Reynolds, found his role in the neighborhood shifting. Once a private individual hoping for a tranquil retirement, he now stood as a community figure who had weathered a storm of prejudice and false accusations. Neighbors stopped him at mailboxes to express appreciation for his calm handling of the ordeal, and some even invited him to casual barbecues or weekend gatherings, eager to demonstrate solidarity. Despite the newfound attention, Marcus remained modest. He knew that true healing would require ongoing effort. Restoring trust, encouraging open dialogue, and preventing any single resident from amassing unchecked power again. To that end, he volunteered to serve on a newly formed HOA committee focused on mediation and dispute resolution. His experience in law enforcement and personal ordeal provided valuable insight into how to diffuse tensions before they escalated. At the committee's first meeting, Marcus outlined a few key principles: transparent communication channels, a requirement for documented evidence before filing serious complaints, and a neutral mediation process that included neighbors from various blocks. These proposals were met with enthusiastic support from many, a stark contrast to the resistance Marcus had faced when Mildred first began her campaign. The shift demonstrated how a single event could catalyze broader changes in community governance. For his part, Marcus continued to invest in neighborhood activities. Coaching a local youth soccer team, offering free self-defense workshops at the community center, and participating in cleanup drives. These actions helped him reconnect with neighbors on a personal level, reminding everyone that the measure of a community lies not in petty disputes but in collective efforts toward shared well-being. On quiet evenings, Marcus would sometimes glance at the now-repaired solar panels on his roof, a subtle nod to how far he'd come from that first encounter with Mildred. He often reflected on the balance between private rights and communal harmony, recognizing that the two could coexist when approached with empathy and mutual respect. In the end, Dairywood Lane emerged from the turmoil stronger and more united. The departure of Mildred Abernathy closed a dramatic chapter, but the lessons learned about entitlement, bias, and the power of reason would guide the neighborhood for years to come. And as Marcus settled back into his peaceful routine, he found comfort in knowing that his quiet stand for justice had helped shape a more resilient community, one where empathy, not entitlement, would chart the path forward. Months later, Dairywood Lane reflected a renewal born from the conflict with Mildred Abernathy. The once tense whispers of late-night 911 calls and petty HOA battles had faded, replaced by neighborly laughter drifting across trimmed hedges and well-tended lawns. At the heart of this transformation was Marcus Johnson, whose steadfast approach to the confrontation had inspired meaningful change. The HOA, once criticized for inaction, now boasted a more transparent leadership structure. They had adopted Marcus's recommended guidelines, requiring documented evidence for serious complaints, rotating committee memberships to prevent power consolidation, and scheduling quarterly forums for open dialogue. These measures, supported by a diverse cross-section of residents, helped diffuse potential conflicts before they escalated. One evening, as Marcus strolled past a block party organized to celebrate the new policies, children waved to him, and adults offered warm nods. It struck him how a neighborhood once fractured by suspicion had come together. Where Mildred's divisive tactics once cast a long shadow, a renewed sense of trust now prevailed. Neighbors he'd barely known before had reached out, grateful for his willingness to stand firm in the face of false accusations. They spoke of how Marcus's refusal to respond with anger, his calm insistence on evidence and due process, had set a powerful example. In private conversations, residents confessed they'd learned to think twice before lodging impulsive complaints, realizing that fairness required restraint and respect for individual rights. Marcus himself took on new roles within the community. He volunteered as a mentor at the local youth center, teaching leadership and conflict resolution skills. On weekends, he led informal workshops at the community garden, where residents learned to grow produce sustainably and share the harvest. These efforts underscored his belief that a strong community depended not on strict enforcement of petty rules, but on fostering cooperation and empathy. Late one afternoon, Marcus paused by the now quiet pool, recalling the bizarre encounter with Mildred that had begun it all. He'd never imagined a day of reading by the water would end with a citation for false reporting and vandalism. Yet, out of that absurd conflict had emerged a stronger, more cohesive community. The irony wasn't lost on him. The path to harmony sometimes winds through unexpected trials. As the sun dipped behind the rooftops of Dairywood Lane, casting long shadows over the manicured lawns, Marcus felt a quiet pride in what the neighborhood had achieved. The gnomes and solar panels, symbols of the earlier dispute, now stood as reminders that peaceful coexistence required both vigilance and kindness. And while he remained vigilant, aware that new challenges might arise, he took comfort in the knowledge that the community had learned to face them together. In the end, Marcus's legacy extended beyond his years of police service. He became a bridge between law enforcement principles and neighborly solidarity, demonstrating that justice and compassion could go hand in hand. And as he locked up his home for the night, Marcus smiled, grateful that Dairywood Lane had not only weathered the storm of prejudice and harassment but had emerged more united than ever before.